Great to be speaking to you across all our Emmanuel sites. I hope you've enjoyed the series this term. We're in the penultimate message of it now. At the Otherside, Part 2, we've been journeying through Exodus. And the passages that we've been looking at in recent weeks have really been bringing some application and detail to one of the most famous passages in the Bible, which is the Ten Commandments. And so we've been looking at, and we're going to be looking at today, lots of different moral and ethical issues. About 10 years ago, the psychologist Jonathan Haidt released a book called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided About Politics and Religion. I think it's quite a helpful book, and in it he seeks to explain why society seems more polarized than ever. All of us have moral opinions, judgments on ethical issues, and that can range from everything to whether a case can be made for just war to whether men should wear shorts in the office. Haidt says that our moral judgments, well, we like to think that they come from well-reasoned arguments, but really, and he sort of proves in the book, that that's not the case. Most of the time, our moral judgments come much more from our feelings, from our gut instincts. He likens it to a rider riding an elephant. The elephant is the emotions, it's the gut instinct, and really that sets the direction of travel. The brain is the sort of the rider riding the elephant, kind of tries to get control perhaps, but really at best comes up with reasons to why this direction is the right direction to go in. The reason I give that example is we're going to look at a passage of the Bible now that brings in lots of different laws to do with different situations and moral and ethical issues. And the way in which it's put together, it goes to different topics very, very quickly. And what will happen as we read it, we'll have different emotional reactions. Some things we'll look at and think, well, that's quite reasonable. Other things we might hear and think, well, that's ridiculous. I just want us to bear in mind that that's going on, and then we'll unpack maybe why that is and what these teachings speak to us today and what we can see about God and who He is from them. So let's look at it now, Exodus chapter 22.
If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest, and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days it shall be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. You shall be consecrated to me. Therefore you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs.
So there we go. Quite a passage, isn't it? We've got everything from don't mistreat widows and orphans, which for many of us will say, well, that's quite a sensible thing, to don't have sex with animals, which we might well react, well, that's just gross, but it does seem that the death penalty for that seems quite severe. And then we also have death to sorcerers, which, again, our reaction might be that seems quite over the top and unnecessary. And maybe many people will read a passage like that and think, wow, this paints God to be angry and vengeful, and maybe that's a God that people associate with the Old Testament of the Bible. Well, the interesting thing is, as I kind of introduced already, we react to moral and ethical issues in a very emotional way, but those emotions often come from our background and our culture. And so depending on that for you on some of these will have a different reaction to the person perhaps you're sitting next to. For example, the first couple of verses that we looked at, verse 16 and 17, describes a man paying a bride price. Many Europeans would think that's crazy. For many Africans, that's a very accepted and standard and honoring practice to engage in. Well, this links back, I think, to what I was talking about already from Jonathan Haidt. And where do our moral judgment comes from? Well, Haidt kind of explains that the reason that different people can so miss each other when it comes to moral issues, it's not just that they're coming from a place of emotion, but also that those moral perspectives come from different moral foundations. And he says that's the reason why, not just say the political left and the political right, it's not just that they don't agree on things, it's that they think each other are crazy. To give an example of this, and I'm going to do so by avoiding perhaps political controversy, and give an example from literature. Les Miserables, a famous musical, is based on the premise of the main character, Jean Valjean. He gets put in prison. He ends up in prison for 19 years for stealing a loaf of bread. Now, let's put that through a moral framework. Is stealing a right or a wrong thing to do? I think most people here would say that's a wrong thing to do. But in the context, he steals a loaf of bread in order to feed a starving child. The moral foundation that many of us would see that through and come to that with is a moral foundation based in care, harm, welfare, thinking of that as the primary consideration. So even though we would say, well, in isolation, stealing is wrong, our moral judgment is shaped from a place of what is the most compassionate and caring thing to do. And we'd say, actually, Jean Valjean does not act inappropriately. He's not doing something wrong. He's doing something that's filled with compassion. And we've got a lot of sympathy and empathy for Jean Valjean. His moral foundation, perhaps, that we view him is from caring moral principles. Now, in contrast to that, we have the other key character in the story is Javert, who's the prison guard, who comes across also as a very moral character, but in a very different way. Javert put Jean Valjean in prison. His moral foundation is about justice, is about fairness. Jean Valjean has broken the law. And for his moral perspective is, well, to treat everyone fairly, the law must be held for everyone. So they're both acting morally, but coming from different foundations and come from different conclusions and are presented to us as sort of polar opposites. All of us would say that fairness and compassion are both moral judgments, but which foundation we choose and associate with a certain situation will shape what conclusion we come to. Another example might be, say, on university campuses, you have the argument about free speech. Should anyone be able to stand on a stage and speak about anything they want, or should that be restricted? Some people would say, from a care moral foundation, if anyone is allowed to say whatever they want, they will say things that are horrible and are not right, and people will be traumatized and victimized as a result. Therefore, we need to protect them. Therefore, we need to restrict free speech to an extent so that people are not mistreated. Another moral foundation for someone else on the other side would come from a place of liberty and oppression, thinking from that moral foundation. To say, we don't like when people are suppressed. And so that's authoritarian, therefore we want to defend free speech and anyone is allowed to say anything, and that's fair because it allows a free platform for everyone. So again, both are moral judgments, but they're coming from different foundations. Why am I giving all these examples and talking like a psychologist? Well, the God of the Bible, we believe, is the source of all morality. But morality is complex, as I hopefully just illustrated. And if God's judgments seem surprising to us in these verses that we read, it could well be that we're seeing the issue or focusing on one moral foundation when actually another moral foundation maybe we've overlooked or undervalued. Let's take the examples that we've just read. In verse 18, it says, "You shall not permit a sorceress to live." Now, most people from a Western context, modern readers, on this topic would probably lean towards that liberty oppression moral foundation that I just referred to. We don't like authoritarian regimes. We don't like people telling us what we can and can't do. And we would associate those things with the death penalty, for example. So when we read about something that involves capital punishment in the Bible, many of us have that reaction to it. We associate it with authoritarian regimes and we react against it. Our society would value the freedom of religion and probably think, well, magic is harmless anyway. I'm really backwards. And the conclusion that many will make as they read a passage like that is to think, well, the Bible presents God as an authoritarian tyrant, and he comes across as a monster because he says, put sorcerers to death. But I want to use this sort of moral foundation argument here to sort of broaden out our perspective and help us to understand this. Because if I appeal to you on the basis of why don't we look at this from the care-harm moral foundation, this is actually about welfare. It's actually about the protection from harm for the people, the community that God is bringing this law to. When we read this passage about you shall not permit a sorceress to live, anyone engaging that should be put to death, there's a few things we have to bear in mind if we're going to understand what is meant by this. Firstly is that we have to understand that this is a community journeying through the wilderness. Prison is not an option. So in our justice system, many of the arguments perhaps that are made against capital punishment is in the context of, well, we have prisons. We can lock people away and stop people having that influence on society and causing harm to society with that. In this context here, that is not particularly an option. There are nomadic people in the wilderness. That's something to bear in mind. Secondly, I also mentioned in a previous week that pagan religious practice that would have been around the Israelites at the time was not harmless. It would have involved the abuse, including sexual abuse and including even child sacrifice. So these alternative spiritual practices that this law is speaking against are not just harmless. No, they would cause great harm to people. And also, thirdly, I would say, if we take the story of the Israelites as a whole, we clearly and vividly see that when God's people do turn to other religious practices and embrace the spirituality of different people groups around them, that led them on a downward spiral that caused death and destruction generationally, not just for a few people, but dramatic effect through generations of people, including death and destruction and war, etc., etc. In that context, putting to death one person who could have had that sort of influence, and this person who fragrantly defied the law of God himself, we can see, hopefully, the goodness, the mercy in this law, because it's about the protection of other people. It's about the death of one person saving the death of many other people. And so just as an example there, hopefully when we take time to consider the context that the law is being given here, what seems at first glance as harshness is often protecting people from an even worse fate. Now notice that I talk about the context here. These are specific instructions for this set of people at this certain time. The primary purpose of the Old Testament law for us is to help us to understand God and what He is like. It's not a handbook for every culture and every situation that we can just map onto our current culture and just think it applies automatically. Now, what we're dealing with here is the fact that morality is complex, and there are different moral foundations, and there is a complex matrix of moral issues that are instilled in these laws, and we need to discern which laws really relate to which foundation. Let's continue journeying through these verses here. I'm going to group together verses 18, 19, 20, and 28 and 29 together, and to say, actually, these are laws that relate to the value of God's authority and the appropriateness of worship to Him. Really, they're applications from the first two commandments. The first commandment, I am the Lord, you shall have no other gods before me. And the second commandment, you shall not make idols. In fact, verse 19, whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death, actually relates to the worship of God, because likely that this is referring to sexual practice with animals that was part of pagan worship and spirituality. So it's not just saying don't do something like that because that's disgusting. He's saying actually don't engage in spiritual practices of other people groups. You are to worship me alone. That's why the next verse says, whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. Again, God's number one command, put God first. The laws associated with that one are the ones that we see here result in a death penalty because the worship of God is paramount. A few more comments on that. Again, remembering the context here, the worship of God really is a life and death issue. That's hard for us to understand when we look at it from a distance. But remember the context of God's people journeying through the wilderness. God is literally providing their food and water to them. If you know the story of the Exodus, He provides bread from the sky. He provides water from a rock. Their dependence on God is literally a life and death issue. And so the consequences of turning away from God's provision was a death sentence in and of itself. And that's not because God is mean, that's because God is good. He's saying, don't go other ways. I will be all the provision that you need. And so this kind of law that talks about don't turn away from God, worship Him as first, this is a life and death issue. It's because God is the source of their life. Verse 28, you shall not revile God nor curse a ruler of your people. Again, the supremacy of God, number one priority. 29, you shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days it shall be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. So these are verses about the primacy of God, the primacy of worshiping Him. Notice where it says the firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. That's talking in terms of a ceremonial devotion to God, consecrating of the firstborn towards him. It's not child sacrifice, not at all. Putting God in his primary place was not about God's ego, but actually it was about organizing this community with God at the center for their flourishing and for their blessing. And this is a principle that applies to our lives as we follow Jesus. Jesus says, "Follow me." Jesus calls to us to a devotion where he is first. Not just because that is right, because he is God, but it's because putting Jesus first in our lives is best for us. Sin is where we put ourselves first rather than him. And in that moment, perhaps, of the act of us doing something that is wrong, we think in the moment that it's better to do something selfishly than actually listen and do what God tells us to do. But all of us who have done that experience, in the end, actually we end up worse off. Sin promises much and it delivers very little. It's bad for us. We talked about last week about stealing. We take what's not ours, thinking that that will be good for us. But even in that, anyone who has done that knows that actually what the reward that we reap from that is not good news for us. Sinfulness, selfishness, grasping, not listening to God ends up in a negative spiral for us. It leads to worry, it leads to anxiety, it leads to further deceptiveness, it leads to the breakdown of relationship with others. We become less, and that's the power of sin. As we sin, we become less of what we are made to be. God doesn't want that. He wants the opposite. That's why he gives us his instruction. As we follow him, it leads us to life, to fullness, to peace, to the blessings of his goodness. God gives us instruction not because he is mean, but because he is good and wants what's best for us. Let's look in more detail at the passages here. There's certain laws here about sexual practice, verse 16 and 17. If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If a father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. I think, what is going on here? Well, the situation that's being described here likely is a consensual relationship. In Deuteronomy, which is another book of the law that sort of corresponds to Exodus, it says clearly in Deuteronomy 22, verse 25, that a man who rapes a woman shall be put to death. So this situation here is more likely describing a consensual relationship outside of marriage. Now, the God of the Bible puts sex and marriage together, and also upholds the value and dignity of people. So the law here is that when people disobey that and have sex outside of marriage, well, that needs to be put right. And the easiest way and simplest way to put that right is for that couple to take on the full responsibilities and obligations of marriage, which in that context would include being married, but also paying a financial amount to the family of the woman involved. And that was accepted. Verse 17 describes how the father of the woman involved may, from a sense of wanting to protect her, may refuse if he thinks, well, this relationship is just not just the wrong way around, but it's actually wrong, and this is not going to be good for my daughter. His protecting instinct is there, and he may refuse. In that situation, the man who has slept with his daughter still must pay the marital obligation of a financial amount. So that's the situation that's being described here. And again, this is quite difficult for a Western modern perspective to read and to understand. Because going back to those moral foundations, when it comes to issues like this, many people would lean into the liberty, oppression, moral foundation when it comes to perhaps and see this through the lens of the subjugation of women, and also more generally when it comes to sexuality. Generally, Western culture that we live in associates issues of sexuality with the moral foundation of liberty and oppression. We don't like people telling us what we should do. We want freedom in this area, and that's what the moral judgments are based around. That's the dominant narrative. And so it finds this type of teaching about, well, if you sleep with someone, you need to marry them. Whoa, that's oppressive. Whoa, where's the freedom there? But here, this perspective is leaning not into the liberty, oppression, moral foundation. It's leaning into the care and harm moral foundation. And I think our society would do well to actually consider the topic of sexuality and sexual permissiveness in those lenses much more often. Because our culture wants to talk about sexuality only in terms of freedom. I'm free to do what I want to do, and if people consent to what they want to do, then things are fine. That is the force of the argument most of all. But our society does not want to slow down to actually consider who is benefiting and who is being harmed when that is the moral framework that is being put forward. Ironically, those who a sexually permissive culture claims to empower are often those who actually lose out. What if sexual freedom also contributes to confused and pressurized and anxious young people? What if sexual freedom that our society celebrates also contributes to the horrific sex industry and the related sex trafficking that happens? What about if it contributes to the degradation of marriage that contributes to thousands and thousands and thousands of fatherless children? What if the sexual permissive agenda that is promoted contributes to the thousands and thousands of unwanted pregnancies that happen every year? That's another moral foundation to look at. Who is actually being harmed by this? What are actually the consequences of this? Well, perhaps that's another sermon for another day. But our culture, it's just a reminder that our culture, like any other, is full of inconsistencies and contradictions. Let's move on to the next passage, laws about social justice. Verse 21 to 27 talks about how to treat the poor. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people who with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering, and if it is his cloak for his body, in what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. We really notice a difference here with the personal presence of God wrapped up in these laws. Did you notice that? God himself personally identifying with the poor, with those who have least. And we see that in the New Testament with Jesus. In his earthly ministry, identifying, spending time with the outcasts of society. See, the God of the Old Testament and New Testament is the same God. But we also have here a connection. God draws a parallel between how the Israelites are to treat others with the fact that they were sojourners in the land of Egypt. They didn't belong there. And also, I'm just going to rewind to the beginning of Exodus chapter 2, this idea of their cry going up to God and God listening. We have that in this passage We had it back in Exodus chapter 2. The people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. And their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant. The God of the Bible is a God who hears, who knows, who understands. Verse 27 here, for I am compassionate, says the Lord. And it's a reminder that all these laws stem from God's compassion. And this passage in particular, God personally identifies with the poor, which is a reminder for the ministry of the church today, ministry of our church, our ministry to the poor, the care ministry of this church that seeks to practically get involved with the people in our community around us who often have the least. It's not just a good thing to do. It's not just something that God tells Christians to do. It's something that reflects who God is himself. Mercy is what God does and what he is like. I want to come into land on this final verse here. Verse 31, you shall be consecrated to me. Therefore you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by the beasts of the field, and you shall throw it to the dogs. I wonder as we read it through what your emotional reaction to this one is. Probably not that much. It seems a sensible thing. Well, don't eat animals that you've not killed that might have died in other ways probably because they might have disease or something like that. But I think there's more to it than that, because it's prefaced with that line, you shall be consecrated to me. And it's this idea, consecrated, holy, set apart. There's a recurring theme right the way through all these passages of God's law. That God is a holy God, that he's different, that he is other. And he's calling his people to be a different people, an other people, not like the other peoples around them, but reflect something of God's holiness in their lives. His desire was not just good behavior for his people, but that his people might be like him, might be fit for him. That's what sort of holy, consecrated means. It means set apart for a different purpose. It's like the sort of special cutlery or crockery that we have at home for guests. It's like it's not for everyday use. It's set apart. It's different. It's of a higher order. And that's how God speaks of his people. I want you to be special. I want you to be different. I want you to be set aside for my ways. And I think perhaps as Christians we fail to recognize that this is what God calls us to. That when we sin, when we do some stuff that God tells us not to do, it's not actually because we're thinking too much of ourselves, but too little. We're stooping down to a level that we're not made for. God's called us to a higher way. And if we really saw ourselves the way God sees us, we would see that sin is far beneath us. It's still God's desire today that his people might be holy unto him, live in his holy ways. How are we doing with that? I mean, even in the verses that we've covered today, verse 16 and 17, I guess we've touched on lust, we've touched on treating others with honor and respect. How are we doing with that? Verses 18 and 20 talks about being wholeheartedly devoted to God in our spirituality, having no priorities greater than him. How are we doing with that? Verse 25 to 27 talks about being generous to others, not selfish, putting others, the needs of others before our own. How are we doing with that? The reality is God's law reveals the holiness of God and the sinfulness of the Israelites and us. I've been talking about our emotional reaction to these verses, but perhaps the key question when we consider all of this is, what's God's emotional reaction to you? What does God think of you? What does God feel about you? That's really the only thing that matters. Are you holy unto him? Are you good? Are you without sin? Are you fit for God and a relationship with him? Or should you, like this verse alludes to, be thrown to the dogs? You shall be consecrated to me. Is that really true? Is God really saying to us today, you shall be consecrated to me? How is that possible? Well, amazingly, this verse points us so wonderfully to the gospel of Jesus. You see, God can't be with sin. We can't be set apart for God and in relationship with him and knowing him and being close to him because he is holy and we are not. So how does God make us consecrated to himself? Well, he does so by sending his son to be thrown to the dogs. In Psalm 22, it has this famous line that Jesus speaks from the cross. As Jesus is being killed on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which is the first verse of Psalm 22. And the whole psalm is a cry of anguish, a cry to God for deliverance. But many of the ideas that we see in this verse from Exodus are also in there. Verse 12 talks about many bulls encompass me. Bulls, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. These are the beasts of the field that are tearing the flesh. For dogs, it says, verse 16, encompass me. A company of evildoers encircle me. They have pierced my hands and feet. That's why Jesus is pointing to this psalm, saying, this is about me. Verse 20, deliver my soul from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Jesus pointed to these words on the cross. He's saying, that's what's happening to me. I'm being overcome by evil. I'm being thrown to the dogs. I'm crying to the Father to deliver me. But the Father does not, in that moment, save him from that death. Why? Because he's choosing that his son might die in our place for our sin, so that we are not thrown to the dogs for our sin, cast off, come under the weight of our sin and overcome by evil, that Christ took that for us, so that you and I might be consecrated, lifted up to God, forgiven, freed, rescued, embraced eternally by the Father. His flesh was torn on the cross for sin, so that you and I could be his holy ones forever. What grace! What a Savior! He is a God of mercy. His desire has always been that we might be holy unto him, and Christ has made it so. Praise God for Jesus. Amen.